So today we're going to be answering the question, what makes a track sound full? I'm going to be breaking down and exploring the answer into its smallest parts and really trying to understand the root of what makes music full. And then we're going to be diving into how we can apply this knowledge to our own productions. So stick around if this is something that's troubled you in the past. But before we jump into it, I wanted to quickly mention the free music production handbook that we have on the EDMProd website, which offers solutions to all of the common sticking points. So links below if you're interested in that one. So I wanted to start off with this little exercise here. Check out this track. I made it alongside this video just as a mere inspiration source. So check it out. So this is a good example of a track because there's not that many elements to it and the track sounds full, right? So what I'm going to do is actually start muting stuff and see where the track stops becoming full, and that will sort of allow us to analyze exactly what elements are giving us fullness in our track, right? So let's take the kick out and see how it sounds. So the kick is giving a lot of context, it's giving a lot of groove, but it's actually not really giving us fullness because we have enough low end, right? So the kick isn't giving us extra, we're not relying on the kick for low end, we have our bass line here. So it's not actually providing any fullness, it's just providing like context for the groove itself. What happens when I start taking out some other drum elements here as well? I'm just going to mute these here. So all of these black ones here are now muted. So now we've taken all the drum elements out and we don't have any rhythm, but it still sounds full enough for it to be a full track. So let's see what happens when I take this forest ambience out. See that when I take that out, it actually loses a lot of its space, a lot of its fullness, right? But even with it out, it still sounds full enough to my ears. But check out what happens when I take this synth out, right? Now it's just completely empty. It's just completely empty. So we still have the low end in here. Maybe I can even put this forest ambience back on and see how it goes now. It's a little bit better, but it's not full enough to be a full track, you know. So this synth is providing all of the fullness here, and the question is why, and what elements we need for a full sounding track. I would argue that all you need is some low end. So a solid low end is pretty important for a full sounding track. And then we also need some space and depth. And the thing about space and depth is they usually come about in the mid-range frequencies. This is because the low end, we don't want any space. We don't want any width in our low end because otherwise it gets messy and muddy. But when we get beyond the low end frequencies, that's when the space comes about and that's where we get the depth in our track. So listening to this track, I've analyzed that all you really need for fullness is low end and some space and some depth. And we're going to explore this a little bit further. This also begs the question, what is fullness, right? So the idea of fullness or space or depth being so important comes from the idea of how our brains actually perceive the world. We have two ears, and this is because it allows our brain to perceive depth. So if we hear a sound that is coming from the left-hand side of us, we can hear it more in our left ear and less in our right ear. And the differences between the left and the right ear is what allows our brain to say, hey, that sound is coming from the left-hand side. It allows us to locate the sound in a room. It allows us to perceive the depth of that sound. So taking this into consideration, our brains are constantly intaking stereo information, right? Sounds that are always different different in the left and the right hand side. In the natural world, we simply don't have sounds that are exactly the same on the left and the right hand side. There's always going to be differences between the left and the right hand side, which allows us to perceive depth. So this ties into music production, because if we don't have enough differences between the left and the right hand side, we don't have that space and that depth that we need. Our tracks become flat and empty because our brain is used to hearing that depth. So as a producer, when we're creating music, we don't have any space unless we actually create it ourselves. So we have this responsibility to create depth and space in our music to make it seem realistic to our brains. Otherwise, it will just simply sound empty. And this is where the concept of fullness in music actually comes from. So with the knowledge of that explanation now, let's have another listen to this, right? And I've turned off that synth again. And what's happening is we're actually relying on this synth for all of the space in our track. And that is not necessarily a good thing, because if I was to then arrange this track out, I'm going to get stuck because after I listen to this synth enough, it starts to get boring. If you listen to this thing over and over and over, it'll start to get boring, but you can't take it out because we're relying on it for all the depth of our track. Because if we take it out, then it sounds empty. So we actually have to supplement the depth with other things in our track, which will allow us to take this element out and not be reliant on it. So I'm going to show you another example of different little loop that I have going on to further explain this to you. So I've got this track here. It's some drums and some bass, and then we have this chord stabs here. So let's have a listen to this. So what's providing the space here? It's this chord stab. So according to our theory, if I am to turn off this chord stab, we're not going to have any space in our track, and this track is going to sound empty. So let's have a listen to this. The difference between that and this, as soon as you turn off this chord stab, it sounds totally empty, and that means that we're relying on this chord stab to create all of the space in our track. So what we'll need to do in this case is actually create another element that has space, which will allow us to actually take out this element. So I've actually got this element in here, which has some delay on it, which has some reverb and echo on it as well, and it sort of just sits in the background and provides some space as well. So let's just have a listen to this. And you can see how these two tracks both work together. And now you can understand how having a little bit of knowledge about space and what elements are providing space in your track will really, really help you when it comes to arranging and producing tracks that sound full. I'm going to sort of show you how we can swap between these two elements and sort of take out some drum elements and sort of create an arrangement that sounds full enough the whole way through. So let's have a listen here. So I've got enough space in this one, so I don't necessarily need this right now. So if I was to take out the drums here, I've still got enough space provided by this. So maybe I could even start bringing this thing in. Maybe we're going to put all the drums back in. So now we've got to find a way that we can actually take this element out. So let's have a listen. So we were able to take this element out there, and that's because I have enough space from this element to supplement what we're losing in this element. So to make our tracks sound full, what we need to do is create a few different elements that are providing space. We don't want to rely on one element, and then that way we can take things out and put things in and supplement the space that's being lost from taking out other elements with new elements, and to have all of these things working together and being cohesive as well. So another little tip that I wanted to mention is I also really like to build space into my drums or my percussion. So what I mean by building space into my percussion is just to have little percussive hits that maybe have a little bit of echo or a little bit of reverb on them that are sort of sitting in the background. Field recordings or background textures is a nice way of creating some atonal space that'll give your track a little bit more realism. All right, so I have this snare hit that I've just brought in here, this one. And what I'm going to do is put some time-based effects on it to create a little bit of depth. So maybe I can grab a delay and I'm just going to play around with this. I've got this, I could do something like this. I'm actually going to duplicate this delay here and make a second delay. And this is going to create a nice little rhythm here. So let's just have a listen to this and sort of turn it down and put it in the background. And this will just provide a little bit of depth to our drums. So maybe I can just have this playing every 4 bars. Maybe I could even put a little bit of reverb before these delays as well. So I'm just going to turn this down and just have a small amount of reverb. We can keep going with this and do some other stuff that's going to provide some depth as well. So I'm just going to mess around with maybe some percussion loops and see if I can find anything that works. So I've just put some reverb on this little percussion loop here. So this isn't perfect and I would fix it up, but you can see how it's providing that depth, right? And that makes it so that it's a little bit easier to have just the drums and this bass by itself. And then we can bring in this thing if we want, right? Right, so building space and depth into your drums as well as having multiple elements that are providing space and not just one synth element that is you're totally relying on will just make your life as a producer and the arrangement so much easier because, you know, later on in the arrangement you won't get stuck and the song will just be a bit more natural in general as well. So I hope this demonstration sort of helped you to grapple this concept of what makes a track full. I'd really recommend to experiment trying this out with your own tracks as well. So like dive into your own tracks and start muting things and see where the actual fullness is coming from your track, where the actual depth is coming from your track. And if you are relying on something, you can try and create something that supports it or also provides the space that you need, and really just get used to using your ear to listen out for fullness. That way we're never really going to get lost with our track being too empty, because we can always create something that's going to supplement and help that section of the song. So I really do hope this has helped you today. If it has, remember to like and subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, thanks for hanging out, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.